All right, welcome everybody to the Trial School Top Shelf Book Club. We've got a link in the chat if anyone wants to take a look for tonight's cocktail recipe. We're going to be taking a break around 6:30 or 6:45 for the lesson on how to make that cocktail. We have Destiny, our bartender from New York, I believe, with us. And hopefully some of you guys will make a drink and we'll drink it. Mike Kelly, who's going to be joining me, asked if we could do it as early as possible, and it's only 3 o'clock on the West Coast. But we'll take at least a half hour before we get to it. We have today, we're so honored to have the author of the final case, David Guterson. We're so honored to have him with us. Many of you have read Snow Falling on Cedars, which is just one of the most incredible books ever written. And I was so excited to read the final case when it came out recently. David has a really interesting background. He taught high school for 10 years. His father, Murray, was a criminal defense lawyer. I don't know how many of you already knew that, but from reading the book, you can see maybe some parallels. He grew up and still lives in the Pacific Northwest. Now, Snow Falling on Cedars has some great trial scenes in it, which the books we usually look at in the Trial School Book Club have to do with trial scenes. The final case is different. Welcome, David. So we're going to do it a little different today because we're not looking at trial scenes to try to figure out how to be better lawyers. What I'm really hoping instead is that it's going to inspire us to do the little things that kind of make the world a better place and make such a big difference. And as lawyers, we have the opportunity to do that. So David, most of the people on are lawyers, for good or for bad. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, not all at once. We have the most amazing panel today too, but I'm going to bring one by one, bring them on so we don't take too long and we don't do it all at once. But let me bring Mike Kelly on, then we'll start with some questions and gradually bring on all our panelists. Mike, I think I said, is on the West Coast. He's from San Francisco. He's without a doubt one of the best and most ingenious trial lawyers in the country. He always finds time to teach trial skills. That's how I think I first met him. He's really generous, truly a special man. He's got verdicts and settlements that are far too numerous for me to mention. He's one of the funniest people I ever met. He may be, I think it's quite possible that he is the funniest person I have ever met. And I know he's going to be making fun of me tonight. So it makes me feel comfortable saying that Mike probably at least has something to do with the fact that he has so many settlements and verdicts, is that he's quite old. He's generously agreed to co-host with me, and I guess he's going to have the joy of correcting me in front of so many people. So Mike, feel free to jump in with any of the questions, to ask your own questions as we start, or comment on anything. I want this to be a conversation. I'm not sure if Mike's been at any of our book clubs before, but it's going to be a conversation. I'll start off with a question for Mr. Guterson. The final case was reviewed in the New York Times book review. When it first came out, I pulled it out and I was able to find it. And the review was by Scott Turow, who we've had on the book club. And, you know, first of all, in the review, he said some of the most amazing things about the book, which are all true. He called the final case a tender, closely observed, and often surprising novel. And he says, this is a quote, in this novel, Guterson is not really writing about who done it or why. His subject is family love, and its silent passions grip the reader like a steady racing current. So my first question is that, do you agree with that? Is that what you set out to write, a book about family love?
Well, before I answer, just let me begin by saying I really appreciate you having me, and I'm looking forward to the time and the discussion. I hope the video is all right. I don't have the greatest internet connection, but if it wavers, comes and goes, I live on an island about a half hour from Seattle. We don't have the best coverage here. Well, yes, to some extent, this book is, it's about familial love, but it's also about a family that's in completely incompetent, ultimately. There's two families here. There's a family that's the center of the trial, And then there's the family that's represented by the narrator and the attorney for the defense, and two very different visions of life. And there's a sort of resonance that goes on between these two families as the book unfolds, which is part of the strategy of the book to allow the reader to examine sort of two potential paths that people can take.
So, yeah, it is interesting how the two families, one of our other panelists who had already emailed me, she's going to come on in a minute, or actually it might have been my paralegal who was telling me she was so moved by one of the descriptions of one of the family scenes, but we'll get to that in a minute. In addition to family love, what struck me was how, and I've told so many people this, I forgive me from saying it again, but I'm going to read from the prologue in a little bit, but it's just so, to me, it really hit me again and again as I was reading the book, how much good one human being can do. In just simple acts, nothing like crazy, but especially as a lawyer. And, this relates to your dad. I'm so curious about in the prologue, and, was your dad like that? If you don't mind me asking.
Yeah, let me back up a little bit and just provide some context. So I was born in Seattle. My father was born here as well, and he went to the University of Washington Law School. He began as a prosecuting attorney, did that for about a year, and then went into private practice in the late 50s as a criminal attorney, and essentially continued to practice in one form or another up until his death in 2013. And he certainly went through a period in the 60s and 70s in particular, where he was very, very busy and had a huge caseload. And as time went by, that tapered off until the last 7 or 8 years of his working life. He really didn't have a lot to do. And of course, you see that reflected in the novel, where the main character, Royal, is completely candid and forthcoming with the narrator about the fact that he doesn't have much to do. And this happened to my father as well, but whether he had a lot to do or a little to do, and whether he was working as an attorney or in any other context in his life, he was always the same. And he viewed every moment of his existence as just an opportunity to be present with people and to be a kind and decent human being. And this permeated his life and gave his life meaning and value and purpose. Where no matter what he was doing, he knew why he was there. He knew what his intentions were, what his values were, what his vision was. And so the book very much, is a celebration of a person who I greatly admired. Yes, very much so.
Yeah, if he's anything like Royal in the book, I mean, I can see why. Interestingly enough, Mike, you had that nickname too, right? Just a coincidence.
Well, I think it's just a coincidence, but the Royal Tannenbaums movie resulted in a number of my adult children beginning to refer to me as Royal. I asked them, could they find me a fellow in an elevator operator's outfit with the epaulets to assist me in the difficulties of my life, and I'm still waiting for them to come through. Hey, let me say that two things. John, that introduction was by far the best introduction I've had in the last 8 minutes. So thanks so much for that. I was touched. But more importantly, the book it's just a marvelous piece of storytelling, among other things. And as John said, we do a lot of teaching of lawyers, and you do some marvelous work, the nature of your craft as a storyteller, but also in the context. And I'm curious, a couple different places. A good example for me, two places that jump out. One is in less than a page and a half, you encapsulate the cross-examination of the brother who comes on as defiant and finishes, and I forget the phraseology, but we hear his crackling, croaky voice at the end. And you are able to do in like a page and a half an essay on cross-examination that lawyers would love. That is the consistent impeachment of what he said in his depositions. And then the opening statements, which you have, they are distilled to their essence, although wonderful stories, but none of them more than, I don't know, I didn't count, but 150 words maybe, and they are all there. And so part of my question is, what I'd like to really have you explain is how do you do that? But I'm not going to ask for that because we don't have enough time. But I'm wondering, where does that come from? Does that come from watching your dad? Does it come from reading the files? Does it come from sitting in court? Because I know much of this is your brain and your imagination and your ability to be a good storyteller, but some of that has to come from homework.
Well, I was from an early age naturally interested in what happens in courts of law because it was my father's work, and on occasion went to see him during trials, watch trials unfold. And, just one of the most sort of natural and obvious venues for human drama and for storytelling. A criminal trial in particular, has sort of beginning, middle, and end. It has rising action, and there's an unknown. And that's why there's this whole genre of fiction that's built around courtrooms. And I embraced the opportunities inherent in that. In my first novel, Snow Falling on Cedars, is a courtroom drama. And then I returned to it in this book. Now, for this book, it's based on an actual trial that unfolded in 2011 in Skagit County, about an hour north of Seattle. And this ended up to be, I think, the longest trial in the history of the county. I think it took about 7 weeks over that summer. And I went every day. And one of the things that leapt out at me was that, well, first of all, I ended up getting, a copy of every day's proceedings, the transcript. And between the transcript and my attendance, I had at my disposal every nuance, every detail, every specific, every particular that I could have made use of. But as a storyteller, and I'm getting to your question, I hope now.
No, that's right.
Part of what you're doing is you're picking and choosing. You can't tell everything, nor should you tell everything. You should look for those moments, for those incidents, for those particulars that serve your theme, that serve the larger story, that do work. And you don't want to linger too long in some place that's ineffective in terms of dramatic profluence, in terms of moving forward the story. And so part of what you learn to do over time when you write fiction is to be a good selector of the moments that really matter, and learn how to winnow through. Life is amorphous. Life isn't a story. And you've got to sort of winnow away at it and find the moments that, in fact, when taken together in sequence, form a kind of story. And one metaphor I've heard for storytelling, sometimes people think it's like building a house. That's one image you might have for it. That you put in a foundation, you gradually build it up until there's this complete work of architecture. But for me, what I think is a more apt and useful image is of a sculptor. You've got this large stone, and buried in this stone, as you chip and hew away at it, is a figure, is an image. And that's really what you're doing. Life is like this big stone, and you're chipping and hewing away at it until the story, emerges. And that's a very important part of the storytelling art.
Let me follow up on that.
And a good metaphor for the storytelling art. Go ahead, Johnny.
Yeah, I want to ask both David and Mike one follow-up question, and then we'll bring Brittany on. But so I think I hadn't thought of it till Mike asked that question, but your openings actually can teach trial lawyers a lot about how to do openings, because we almost always go too long and include things we shouldn't. And when you said, winnowing down, it just occurred to me, and maybe tomorrow I'll realize this is a foolish thing, but maybe we should cut way down all the things we think are going to be important during the trial and do an opening like David did, you know, I'm sure the real one wasn't that good. No offense to the real lawyers, but there's no way it was. I've been in the courthouse. I see the kind of work we do. Should we do it more like those openings? And I'd like both of you to answer that, but let's start with David.
Well, I suppose I'll begin. You know, I've noticed in the legal arena at least two sort of approaches. And one of them is and this is what happened in this trial in 2011 with both the prosecution and the defense. They throw everything at the wall and hope something sticks.
Yeah.
And it exasperates ultimately everybody, the jury, the judge, and not only that, but the essence of the case gets cluttered. It gets muddied. Now, my father's approach was always the opposite one. You find the linchpin, you find the key thing, and you pound away at it, and you keep it in the forefront, and you keep it clear, and you build your case around something that everybody can see is the crux, the critical matter. And so applying that to opening statements, I know perfectly well that the opening statements, the closing statements, the testimony, everything I do in my books really doesn't bear very much resemblance to reality. You can't do it in a story. If you really look at what happens in a courtroom, and let's face it, there are sort of a lot of minutia, a lot of legal sort of gamesmanship going on, a lot of interruptions, a lot of things that wouldn't work on the page of the story. So I don't want to claim that the opening statements in my book are somehow realistic. They're not, but they are the sort of thing where everybody cuts to the chase, where everybody has a theory of the case that is an essence, rather than throwing everything at the wall and going on forever and exasperating everybody.
Yeah, and let me just say that you can come teach with us anytime, and I'm inviting you to teach with me anytime for this reason. I don't think these are opening statements that you would give in a double murder case here, but they are, and they capture the essentials. Your prosecuting attorney is not bombastic and has organized the facts in a way that are just punching you in the nose. There is no error. There are no adjectives, which is the curse of the lawyers who think that that's important. Ms. Burris does exactly what you do with two defendants. I started out as a criminal defense lawyer. We are going to split this up right now, and this is a good and decent man. And then Royal does really it's just such a wonderful example of opening up to the honesty of and I'm sorry if I'm saying this wrong, but this is a terrible person. But there's a difference between convicting somebody of a terrible person and convicting them of this crime. And that is, in fact, the essential work that criminal defense lawyers have to do. We do civil work now. I did it in the beginning. It is the hardest job on earth because, as Royal says, I've tried a lot of these cases. I've lost almost all of them. This is hard work. But the fundamental argument that you incorporate there, that's a lesson for all of us, somebody needs to do this because you don't say this, but everybody's guilty of something. And if we're going to convict somebody of murder for being a horrible human being, then I think he says something about we've gotten to a dictatorship. But fundamentally, what we've done is we've lost the rule of law. And so I'm sorry for talking so much. It's your interview. But I just want to say from the lawyer's perspective, no, these are not verbatim openings. But I will tell you that each one of these, for anyone who does this work, recognizes the kernel of importance that they are distilled down to the essential truth. And the character, and I don't know if it is your dad or close to your dad, but that character represents, for those of us who do this work and believe in it, all that's good.
Yeah, so let me just comment on that. A lot of people have brought up and emailed me and wanted to talk about that quote about we might as well live in a dictatorship if you convict someone for being bad instead of breaking the law. I'm sure that's going to come up again. I'm glad you brought that up, Mike. And look, I'm going to agree with you, Mike, on that these are great openings, but I think I'm going to go even further. There's no perfect opening statement, but there's disadvantages to any one you could give. If you gave one that short in your next case, you'd be better off than the one you're going to give. It's not that there's no disadvantages. It's just that the one you're going to give has disadvantages too. And it forces you to really think about the linchpin. I love that. And I'm going to mention that, if you don't mind, David, and when I'm teaching, find out the linchpin, pound away at it. Do it in opening, but do it in your case. And we don't do that enough. All right, let me bring Brittany on. I want to start bringing, we've got 2 more panelists and I want to bring them on in a way that doesn't take too long. Brittany, she's an author. She and her partner, Brad Edwards, have been on the book club for their book, Relentless Pursuit, which is phenomenal. Brittany, really a great job as an author, and even more impressive because most lawyers who write books, let's be honest, those books are no good. But she's one of the great lawyers who took on Jeffrey Epstein. She's co-founded 2 charities for sex abuse survivors. She's gotten amazing results for her clients, some giant verdicts. So why don't we start with that, Brittany? What do you think about doing an opening that short?
So honestly, I've been so excited to talk to you, David, just about this exact topic, because something stuck out to me, which is that in every opening in our civil cases, we try to highlight all of the bad facts. Anything that the defense is going to try to come out and throw in our face later on, we try to put it out ourselves to the jury in our own way. So to read, your dad, or this character standing up and saying, my client is guilty, and all of these bad things about your client, ending with, even though my client is guilty, they're not guilty of this. That's exactly what we try to do in our openings and throughout the trial. It's, you may think X, Y, and Z about our client, but no matter what the defense says to you, this still happened. And putting that out ourselves, as opposed to allowing the defense to come in and say, you heard a beautiful story over here, but what they didn't tell you is this. If we're the ones telling them, as opposed to the defense, it just seems more credible, and it's a better way to address that. So I really enjoyed reading that portion of your story, especially because I thought that it highlighted that one particular kind of element that we try to throw in all of our cases.
Mhm.
You're saying in particular, in the kind of cases you have when you're representing someone who's been the victim of some type of sexual abuse or assault?
Exactly. And so oftentimes, they have a past of promiscuity or drug addiction or certain things that the defense is excited to share. You have this person being put forward as a victim, but they're not a victim. And not only is that not true for things that are irrelevant to this discussion, but, it allows us to say, your client, the defendant, is the one who caused our client to become a drug addict, to, undergo these different bad things in their life. And if we say that, it allows us to create a narrative that's actually true, as opposed to if we hide those facts, the defense gets to say them and paint our client in a way that isn't necessarily fair. So I just felt that highlighting the bad facts up front is very important. And it was interesting that you did that.
Mhm.
So
Well, I
Brittany,
think-
sorry, go ahead, David.
Well, I just want to respond briefly. There's the matter of honesty that's, I think, essential. As an attorney royal, or my father, whichever way you want to look at it, he's a human being. He has an opinion. He has feelings, and he's aware that everybody else does too. The judge, the prosecutor, the jurors, everybody in the courtroom has feelings. And naturally, when you have a case that's so horrific, like this one, a homicide that results from child abuse, you have an immediate set of circumstances that's going to be offensive to anybody just coming onto the scene. And to acknowledge that openly from the beginning is important. You can't dismiss it. You can't try to work your way around it. You have to acknowledge the truth. Horrific things have happened, and people have done things that are wrong. If you don't do that, then your strategy is missing this essential piece of honesty that's needed as you could say, a rhetorical device in some way. But honesty is very powerful. I just wanted to throw that into the conversation.
I wrote that down too. So now I've got a list of things that I'm gonna have to remember in my next trial in January. Brittany, jump in anytime. Please feel free to interrupt me in particular. I don't know about Mike. Sometimes he gets ornery, but
He can make fun of you too. I'm okay with that.
Good. All right. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll bring Kristen on. I'm saying that to give some notice to Roland, who's working with all the tech stuff. So I guess it does seem a little clunky, but I got to give him a little warning. So let me ask you a question, David, again about process, which Mike started, so I feel like I can get away with. And this is the last time I'll quote something Thoreau said, I promise. But he said, with the first 70% of the novel, how do you say that? H-E-W-I-N-G, Ewing? With the first 70% of the novel, Ewing, I read it and in my mind it was okay, but I realized I don't know how to say it. With the first 70% of the novel, Ewing so closely to the details of the Harvey case, it is startling, even disorienting when the trial comes to a precipitous close and the case receives only passing mention in the remaining pages. So, but then the ending hits so hard, which I'm going to ask you about in a little bit. Is that why? I mean, as an author, were you trying to disorient us with the way you handled the rest of the trial so that, we were disoriented and the ending could be so powerful emotionally?
I think clearly the natural expectation in a book that's got a trial is that somehow the verdict and the sentencing will be the climax of the book, will be the sort of pivotal moment, and the book is leading to an outcome, innocent or guilty, which is the formula in most courtroom dramas. Of course, it's always followed by a sort of denouement in which the loose ends are tied together, or whatever is still sort of outstanding as a question in the minds of readers is answered, and it's all very formulaic. Snow Falling on Cedars, my first novel, follows that. Adheres to that formula. Now, this isn't a novel. The final case isn't really a novel in which questions of guilt or innocence, or even the questions that are sort of fundamental to the trial, are really at the center. And so about 2/3 of the way through the book, I do something that completely flies in the face of reader expectations, and it really sort of, in a sense of narrative art, is subversive. And that is, suddenly the trial's over without really being over. One of the principal participants in it is no longer able to continue, and the case has to be retried at a later date. Now, if you're a reader at that point, you have all kinds of feelings, but one of them is, well, now what? The thing that I was counting on to keep me turning the pages isn't here anymore. And that puts the writer in a very difficult position, because the last third of the book has to justify that decision. And the last third of that book has to somehow be a kind of, I guess, illumination for the reader in some sense of why that move was made. And the story has to expand beyond guilt and innocence and be a larger story in which the trial just simply plays a part. The trial is not the end all and be all. It is not the story per se. It's one element in a larger story, and that was my intention. And I certainly there's some risk in 2/3 of the way through the book in just sort of ending it. And I've seen commentary from plenty of readers who feel like a sense of disappointment, or they feel that the last third of the book, the writer is flying off in all these different directions that don't seem relevant. But I mean, I know from my thought process while writing the book that everything I do in the last third of the book is in fact tied to an intention and does have a reason for a story that's bigger than the story of the trial.
So can I just, if I just could jump in and say, okay, so I'm not very smart, which is why I'm still doing this at a very old age, trying to get better at it. But I'm in that place and I'm reading it. And now I know more about tea than anyone would ever know. I mean, as a youth, I smoked more tea than I ever drank, and that's probably still the truth. And I was initially, of course, I'm like, well, I wonder what happened, until I'm about halfway through that 1/3. And because I'm a slow learner, to recognize that really this trial was about showing that there's good and evil, and the good people at the end of the day are more interesting And, you know, I'm near tears, whether it's the narrator talking about his dad or his mom or Allison or the other shop. And actually, I think I secretly wanted to know what happened. But I then became really very much interested in how does it end? Not are we going back to trial, because the number of pages are winnowing down. This case could not be tried in a shorter, you know. So I mean, I'm so happy to hear that, you know, you're driving on the shoulder and immediately drove off the shoulder, but you didn't crash. You got back on the road, that this is not some kind of customary or well-known literary detour. So actually, that's the best thing I've heard all day, because I of course, I'm confused. I'm easily confused. Just minutes ago, I was confused. And so it worked. It worked. But I guess it's, you know, it's like when we try a lawsuit and we try something like, I don't know, nobody's ever done this, but I feel like it has to happen here. So there must have been a reason you did that, because you wanted to make the greater point about the family and about Royal and about your dad and about what's important.
Did you know how big of a risk you were taking when you did that? Was that something as you were writing that you knew this could work, this could not work, and you're kind of trying to see what would happen?
You know, I knew in the conventional sense, in terms of, you know, the marketplace, reader response, sales, and so on, that this was a counterproductive move. You know, that people have certain expectations about stories, and they need to have those expectations met. And if they feel disappointed, you know, then somehow the writer hasn't given the reader what they want and need. So yes, I knew that. I knew that I was doing that, but that's okay. You know, I felt like I had a different story to tell, and fortunately, I had a really nice relationship with my editor, who understood what I was doing. My publishing house was sort of supportive of it, and the book has taken on, you know, a life of its own, and has, you know, it has its readers who understand it for what it is. If I could just briefly, though, going back to a case in point, you brought up tea. Now, thinking about how tea works in this novel. So first of all, just in terms of the sort of the bag of tricks, if you will, the sort of bag of tools that the writer brings to the desk when working, the tea shop was a great device. I could bring people together there, and I could create context, and I could bring in this sister who also is living a life like the father's, in which everything she does is connected to this larger purpose of caring about others, even in the simplest way of serving others, as in the Hemingway story that's referenced in the novel, A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. You know, you're doing something good for people by making this opportunity for them to come in from the cold and have a cup of tea together and have conversations. So the tea shop provides that. It provides me with a tool, so to speak, for storytelling, but it does more, because where that motif goes and where it ultimately sort of you know, resolves is at the end, when one character points out to another, you know, you stop and think about matters of justice and fairness. Everybody is culpable, and everything can be, you know, brought to bear. The very tea that you drink is only available to you, you know, this really nice thing, because of exploitation of other people. And it goes back hundreds of years. The tea trade, the coffee trade, chocolate, all these things that we take for granted. These are all have long-standing histories behind them that involve a suffering of thousands and thousands of human beings, and exploitation and privilege, you know? And so even tea, even where the tea motif ends in the story, I hope resonates with some of the larger questions in the book.
All right, let me bring our last panelist on before. Don't worry, Mike, we will get to the bartender. But In the
No,
meantime, we're gonna,
I could probably go without the bartender.
you already started? So we're bringing on Kristen Bianculli. She's one of my former partners. We got to work together when she was still in law school. And then for another decade, she's named in the Best Lawyers in America, 2011 to 21. Mike, you first got named in 120 years before that, correct?
Yeah, thank you so much.
She's been Lawyer of the Year in product liability. I've tried cases with her. She's made the jury and me cry multiple times in trial. So Kristen, let me just jump right in because you had texted me or called me or emailed me. You had said you had a quote that you said moved you. Lawyers take their, this is, I actually might have not written down the exact quote. I apologize, from the book, but lawyers take their cases so the law can get on with what the law is about. Why was that? Why did that move you so much?
Because I think what the law is about, in that it hit me because it was, what does Royal think the law is about? What is his purpose for taking this on? And I think that, you know, as the trial lawyers here on this panel and just wanting to do right by your client and change the world and make it better, that's what, to me, getting on with the law is about. Because if we're not constantly working to change it and make changes and push things to be more fair and to be better, then what's the point? Because it was page, I know the exact page, it's like page 24. And then again at page 128, I was sitting there slowly either drinking tea. At one point I was drinking whiskey and water about your dad, like the whole thing hit me so emotionally as a lawyer and as a mom. I was crying. I was thinking how wonderful it is to sit there and ask that question, and to have everybody here really sit and think about why you take on some of the hardest cases possible. And to me, it really is, that was a great answer. And I was so curious as to what you meant by that, or what you meant Royal to mean by that. Because, you know, me personally, it hit me hard, and I'm sure everyone has their own interpretation of what that could mean. And ultimately, when he says it doesn't matter what I think anyway, because it matters what the jury thinks, is also like the boom smack to your face after I sat there like, why do I do what I do? Because I want to help the world. And then it's like, and it doesn't even matter why, like what I think, because who cares unless I do a good job. So what was the motivation?
Well, I grew up with this, you know, this is, and from my father's point of view, it was just a given, and it was obvious, and there was no question about it, that every single person is innocent until proven guilty, and everybody needs fair and just representation. And it doesn't matter what you think of the person, or if you've already tried them because you've seen a news story or read the newspaper. You know, from my father's point of view, it was just absurd that anybody would think something different from what he thought about it. And sometimes people would say, you know, how can you do what you do, defending all these terrible people? You know, how if you're going to go in the law, you ought to be a prosecutor. My dad say, well, actually, the first year I was a prosecutor, you know, just sort of try to disarm the person. And then he'd say, and, you know, well, before that, I sold shoes, because it didn't matter if you were the prosecutor, the defense attorney, or the person selling shoes. You always have the same opportunity, right? You always have the same golden opportunity in every moment of your life to bring the good to bear to the extent that you can. I also want to speak to something I heard you say about the emotional quality of the book, and where that comes from. So my wife and I adopted a girl from Ethiopia in 2006. It was the same year that Larry and Carrie Williams, who are the real world characters on which the Harvey couple in the book is based, adopted a girl named Hannah. And our daughter and Hannah appeared on the same, you know, available children DVD. And so our daughter could have ended up in the Williams home. So I got emotionally sort of involved in a deep way because of that element. and so I had that going on, but that was part of the emotion. The other thing was is that during that summer of 2013, while this trial was unfolding, my father was in, the last few months of his life, and he had Alzheimer's. And, it was poignant and sad. I would sometimes, I would drive down to Seattle at the end of the day in court, and my father always had enough coherence and, a mental capacity to take an interest in the trial, even though his mind was going in so many directions. And he was, within about a month of the trial ending, he passed away. So for me, I had these sort of emotional convergence of the trial and my father's passing. And there's no way that I could have written this book without that sort of emotional quality that you mentioned, because of the personal circumstances behind the book.
Can I,
It's hard.
may I just ask two, I hope, short questions? The first one is back to the trial. I think you do, your judge, who is stylized here, and the notion of "I denounce you" is at some elevated level of, I don't know, I read that and thought, this judge is the right person with the right personality, and this is the perfect word, number one. And I'm wondering, who is that? And is that someone you'd seen, or is that, and the power of that word, number one. And then the second one, because I want to ask it before we leave, so I don't care when you answer it. Get me my shoes. Is it symbolic? It's not symbolic. Is it, it's not by accident? And so those are my two, and I will be quiet. It's hard for somebody named Kelly to be quiet, but I will be quiet.
Well, starting with the second one, bring me my shoes. There's definitely a way to read that or interpret that within the context of the book, is which, even though it's the last day of my life, I'm really not done yet. And my brain, my heart still go on, wanting to serve in the same way. I need my shoes. I can't function and I can't be the person I want to be without them. Bring me my shoes. Not only is it in the novel, but literally with the last words I heard my father say as well.
Oh, wow.
The other part of your question, can you sort of rephrase that?
Yes, I mean, when I get to the judge, we all have visions of judges, from the sternest, most obnoxious to the quietest and meekest. And this is a person in such a horrible circumstance who essentially has exploded, not having the exploded head, but has exploded in a way that is both elegant and powerful, and says it all using a word I don't think I've ever heard a judge say, which is, "I denounce you."
Mm-hmm. Well, the judge in the case at Skagit County in the Williams trial 2013 was really something. I mean, somebody you could really admire. And I went to see her privately in her office after the trial, and I asked her about her statements, and I asked her about her point of view, and I asked her on what basis did you go for this extraordinary sentencing move? Of course, she had first and foremost a legal answer, that she had been very careful along the way not to do anything that would open the door to a successful appeal. And she felt like she was really ironclad in that way. And so she could go for extraordinary sentencing. And she wanted to go for extraordinary sentencing because she felt so strongly about what had unfolded. But I said to her, to tell you the truth, I've never really understood what sentencing is about. At some level, it sort of doesn't make sense. A person commits a crime, and then you say, well, because you did this thing, you're going to go sit in a cell for the next 20 years. And that is society's response to what you did. Like, what good does it do? What's the purpose? And so I asked her that. And why would you put somebody in a cell for 20 years or 30? And in the case of the Williams, 37 years. Why? What does it do? Someone sits in a cell and they sit there for 37 years. What's the point? Is it merely punitive? Is it supposed to somehow, scare people from doing, this sort of thing? a warning to society? Is it a social statement? Is it a denunciation? What theory of sentencing do you have? How do you justify doing this to somebody? It's telling them to go sit in a cell for 37 years. And denunciation was something that she brought up. She said, in the end, a trial is a public matter. People are watching. And a trial makes a public statement. The outcome of the trial says something to society about who we are or who we want to be. And you have to keep that in mind when you sentence. Their sentencing is a reflection of larger cultural questions, larger social questions that are in play at any given moment in our history. And this, this was important to her. Now, I mean, we had a great conversation because I said that may well be true. And sentencing isn't exactly like, what the jurors are charged with doing, which is guilt or innocent. And I think with guilt or innocence, you can't take into account the larger cultural or social context. It's, your trier is a fact. But in sentencing, it's a different, fundamentally different sort of arena in which you're operating, in which the questions are different. And she made a very good case for that.
All right, so I'm gonna bring on the bartender now. It's just 4 minutes for everybody to rest or make drinks, whatever you would like to do. Kristen, good job. You see, you got the Campari. And then when we come back, Brittany, if you could be ready to lead us with the first couple of questions when we come back, that'd be great. Destiny is it
Hello.
Destiny? Yeah, hey, Destiny. So you're still in New York?
Yes, I'm in my office below my bar.
Oh, I was gonna say you're not at your bar, but I guess you're below.
No,
your
I
bar.
am. I'm just in my basement office.
All right,
Working
so thank you for doing this again. Tell us the name of your bar for everyone when we're in New York City.
We are in Bandits. Let me get one of our menus right here. Bandits on 44 Bedford Street in West Village.
Awesome. All right, I'm gonna turn off my video so we can bring our volunteers on who are actually gonna make the drink as to the best of their ability as Destiny tells them how, and hopefully they're gonna make good drinks. So Deborah and John and Scott, if you could turn your video on.
Welcome, Deborah, John, and Scott. Glad to have you. Today we're going to be making the Negroni Spagliato, which Negroni is one of the great classic cocktails from Italy. And this is a variation of it called the Spagliato, which in Italian means mistake. And all it is really you're taking, instead of gin, putting Prosecco or a sparkling white wine of your choice. I love the Negroni because it's one of the simplest but most eloquent cocktails in that it's equal parts of everything, perfectly balanced with 3 ingredients. You have your sweet vermouth, you have your Campari, and usually gin, or in this case, Prosecco for me, or a sparkling white wine of your choice. And what we're gonna do, I'm gonna show you the glass. We're gonna measure everything out, 1 ounce, or like I said, equal parts. Really, you can use any measuring apparatus as long as everything is equal. First, we're gonna add our sweet vermouth. Then we're gonna add our Campari, the exact same amount. And we're gonna give these a bit of a swirl with any stirring device. I have a proper bar spoon here. Give it about 8 to 10 turns. And then we're gonna add 1 ounce, or since you're making it at home, you add a little extra of your sparkling white wine. We're gonna pour that on top. Give it a twirl. If you'd like, you can garnish with an orange twist, an orange peel, an orange wheel, a slice of orange, anything you like. I like mine without a garnish. So here we are. Cheers. Your Negroni Spagliato.
Awesome, and that was quick. I think it was even less than 4 minutes.
All right. Well, I can give you my theory of how it was created if you'd like.
Yeah, I'd love to hear that. And then also tell us if I'm a bad person, because I just like a regular Negroni without this Spagliato.
That's okay. That's okay. No, I mean, it's so you have the Negroni, then came the Americano, much like with coffee, where they just took out the gin and put in soda, because according to Italians, Americans can't handle the flavor. And then the Spagliato, which my theory is there was once a bartender who made the first Spagliato Negroni. He gave it to the customer. The customer said, "You spagliatoed my Negroni." He's like, no, no, no. I didn't spagliato your Negroni. It's Negroni spagliato. And there we have it.
All right, thanks. Thank you,
Been a
Destiny.
pleasure as always.
Great. So David, we do that usually. It's nice to have a little bit of break, and Destiny's always great. And so I hope that's okay. And you
Oh, yeah.
bear with us. Mike wouldn't agree to do it unless we had a drink.
Yeah, well, and I actually made two, one for my secretary, since drinking is prohibited in my office, and one for me because I have a prescription from my doctor.
Good. All right, so Brittany.
Yeah. So David, I actually just wanted to start by thanking you for sharing your personal story that you and your wife adopted a child from Ethiopia, because I think Kristen, I know, will agree with me that so much of your book was so moving, and so it felt so personally connected that, there were times where both of us, we were talking earlier today, were crying. And now knowing that you had this personal connection to the story, and I'm sure you were envisioning your own life and your own child in writing it, I think that that's just incredibly profound, and it makes sense why what you wrote had such a meaningful impact on us. And that being said, my question for you is, during the interview with Betsy's mom, where there's like pages and pages of these horrible things that are being said. She's talking about woke people, brainwashing, and victims of this liberal progressive ideology. Was that difficult for you to write when in your, when it's kind of attacking your own personal situation, you're putting yourself into the mind of this person who obviously does not have similar ideals to you? And I just think as a writer, that must have been very difficult, but it came across as unbelievably profound to me.
I mean, fundamental to what storytellers do is at least attempt to put yourself into the point of view of other people. If you can't do that, you're going to have a hard time creating characters. So, you're constantly asking yourself, who are these people? How do they feel? What do they think? And you really can't write the next sentence without steeping yourself in the reality of someone else's point of view. Otherwise, you're writing memoir or autobiography. You're only writing about yourself. So here I've got this person, and I look at various news sources and I see what the strains are, what sort of the constant, harangues are, the sort of recurring themes that you get on the right, the recurring themes you get on the left. They may not be my themes, but I'm certainly aware of them, just I think as most of us are. I mean, we live in a combative, divided society, and as a result, we're very highly attuned to points of view of other people, points of view that befuddle us, points of view that we agree with. I think we're constantly paying attention to the culture war that we find ourselves in as a society. So it's not hard to find the raw material. It's not hard to know the substance of what this person would say. The bigger question is, how would she say it?
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to that sort of thing, you fall back on two things. One is, what am I like when I'm mad? And the other is, what have I observed in other people when they're mad? When people get so mad that they can't stop talking. How does it come out? What is the diction of it? What is the syntax of it? What is the tone of it? How does it feel? And to write that longish harangue was a function of, number one, because I'm an American, I sort of know what the basic culture war issues are. Number two, I gave some thought to my own utterances when I'm angry and to the utterances of others, and just worked with that.
Brittany, your book, it was a memoir, but you and Brad did try to, I think you did a good job of trying to get in, not to switch subjects, but since you brought this up, like even Epstein, you guys tried to figure out where he was coming from and what he was thinking, which must have been difficult.
Exactly. And that's actually kind of part of the reason that I asked you the question, David, is because as someone who has helped to write a book where there was a lot of emotional and turmoil, and introspective reflection on things, I saw a lot of that in what you were writing. And it was really difficult for, you know, when Brad would tell a story about his personal meetings with Jeffrey Epstein, I would then try to take that and kind of make it make sense to a reader. And so there was a lot of like massaging of words and trying to figure out how to frame things that I just thought you did a really remarkable job on in your book.
And I think there's another part to this, which is, as I mentioned earlier, you know, I was really steeped in the idea of innocent until proven guilty, and the idea that, look, everybody is a human being. You know, certainly there's such a thing as a psychopath and the sociopath, where the evil in certain people, the violence in certain people is beyond comprehension. But most people are like you and me. We're sort of befuddled, we are confused, we have a whole range of thoughts and feelings. We're sort of all over the map. And you know, that's the truth about the majority of human beings. And to just say to yourself that somebody on the far right or somebody on the far left is just nuts or crazy or completely different from me is to sort of deny them their humanity. So being steeped in this idea of being fair to everyone, of giving everybody their humanity, you know, honoring everybody as a human being, whether you agree with them or not, and try to understand what made them what they are, what brought them to this sort of worldview that they have. It's really important, you know, for a storyteller. If you can't empathize with your characters, they become two-dimensional very quickly.
Do you feel like that's something that you learned from your father as a defense attorney who you know, went to court with, and you kind of saw defending the worst of people or the most innocent of people?
You know, less from my father professionally than in other regards, just, you know, as a general principle in life, to treat everybody with dignity and respect, and not come to your relationship with other people with assumptions, or not to quickly, you know, fault somebody. They say one thing that sounds, you know, far to the right, and you just assume they're far to the right on everything. And you shouldn't do that. You don't know that everybody's complicated. This idea that everybody stands for something, that there's something called, you know, a right-wing fundamentalist, or there's something called the elite, progressive elite, or progressive, you know, those are just categories. Inside of it, each of us is a completely full, complex, nuanced human being who doesn't really fit anything. And that's the lesson that I sort of got from my father, just in general, not simply in the legal arena.
But you did have royal comment, right? You brought up that scene where she had her speech, which you got inside, and, you know, what would someone say if they were angry? And it was phenomenal, and really, I think, you know, an amazing job of getting inside her head. But then you have Royal say she could have been helpful to her daughter on the stand. She could have told the jurors a lot about Betsy so they could come to understand her better, but no, she's full of anger instead. The world's a terrible place in her head, filled with terrible, horrible people who are 100% wrong about absolutely everything. That's her whole point. When I come to her and say, can you help me put the facts in front of the jurors? Anger instead of anything else. Plus, she was surly to you, and you're my son. But forgetting about the first part, I mean, isn't that you talking, or your dad? I mean, you didn't totally get inside her head. You have a view.
Well, there's another piece to it there, and I do have a view, but you know, things move one step past what I was talking about earlier, which is when you think about what you say, you know, sort of the filters that go on in your heart and mind before you open your mouth. One of them is it useful? You know, like, does it need to be said? And here this woman had a perfect opportunity to actually be useful, you know, to a court of law, to a decision, to jurors. She could have actually been useful, but instead her motivation is anger. So she speaks a lot of wasted words that don't do anybody any good and are gone, you know, 5 minutes later. So that's sort of the next piece of it. And yes, that is my point of view. I mean, I tend towards this aphorism that I heard so many years ago. I don't even know where it came from, but it's like, mouth open, already a mistake. And, you know, you should think before you speak. And you should ask yourself whether there's any purpose, any value, any good that will come of it. Otherwise, you know, it might just be self-serving or a habit, or have no reason to do it.
All right, well, and everybody feel free to jump in. I'm sure everyone's questions have been much better than mine. And if you want to talk about anything, David, that we're not asking, feel free to ask that too. But in the meantime, I have a question for everybody. And this is kind of related to trial. I was struck by something, I guess I already knew that trials can turn on moments that mean a lot more than they should logically. Even in books, in Presumed Innocent, we talked about with Scott Turow, the cross-examination of the coroner. It doesn't actually logically establish much, but emotionally for the reader and in the courtroom, it changes everything. And we've seen that in trial. But you had something that was so interesting when they saw the picture on the headboard. It was just in a photo of the room, the Harvey's bedroom, was the painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, and then 2 stout sticks, a sheath knife, and a wooden sword. I had to ask myself in the courtroom, what was the painting doing there? What would be I couldn't think of a plausible or reasonable answer. I understood it wasn't an important question. The sticks, the knife, the wooden sword beside the bed, they were there in the shadow of danger, I thought, as weapons at hand for the Harveys should they be surprised in bed by enemies. I mean, this is for everybody. I mean, do trials turn on a picture that nobody even realized in the background there was above the headboard, a picture of Washington and 2 stout sticks?
Well, now here we are headed into 2023, and I first started thinking about writing this book literally 10 years ago, and so I'm trying to remember that passage. I kind of think, though, that particular image isn't really enter into the testimony and isn't really present in the trial. It's one of the things that the narrator comes across because of his interest. And towards the end, he says that he engaged, the Freedom of Information Act, and he went into the docket and he just, box after box of stuff to look at and got absorbed in it for its own sake. And that's, of course, what I did too. And so I did see plenty of stuff, including pictures like that weren't in the trial. So they inform the narrator's perspective on the case and on the people, and they provide insight, but ultimately those things are not admissible, right? If somebody had come forward and said, I want to show this picture to the jury of this Washington crossing the Delaware photo, the judge would say, why? There's no reason for that. So, there's two different ways of viewing that detail.
Yeah, I could be wrong.
Actually, can I just say, John, I really felt that the book was written for me, reading it laying next to my wife, looking up at the picture of Washington that hangs above our bed. And I just started to tingle all over, and then made another one of these Negronis.
He could think of, our narrator could think of no plausible or reasonable reason for you to do that, Mike. I could be wrong, but I think, even if I'm wrong, let's assume for a second, but I think in the book, there was a photo that was entered in evidence. No one mentioned the painting. Nobody mentioned the sticks. The narrator just kind of commented on them, but that happens to jurors too. I was a juror in a case and I was looking at things the lawyers didn't talk about. That's kind of why it's so scary to try a case. It's why our openings are so long, because we're worried about every little thing that some juror might think.
Mhm.
I guess I already had a negative view of the Harveys, but it just, why'd you mention them? I mean, they struck me too as important, but I don't know why.
Well, going into this question of, when a case may very well turn on an emotional response.
Right.
You know perfectly well that something happens along the way that the jury responds to beyond, their clearly identified role as strictly triers of fact. We all know that the truth is that they're human beings who feel emotion, and they cannot separate those two things. They cannot put them aside. That was part of what made the jury selection process so interesting for me. But how many people were willing to articulate up front, no, I cannot be simply a trier of fact. I am going to have an emotional response. You don't want me because I can't do what I'm being asked to do. It's the rare person, the rare juror who really can make that keep those things distinct and separate, which is, the sort of iconic film, 12 Angry Men. It has this element. 11 of the jurors are bringing all kinds of emotional response, some of it very much having to do with their personal circumstances, relationships with other people, psychological elements in their lives. And there's one person who just keeps saying, but let's just look at the facts, because that's what we're asked to do. And it's really hard to do. And we don't have to do it if we're in the gallery. We don't have to do it if we're reading the book, but we do have to do it if we're jurors.
All
Can
right,
I ask a mechanical question for those of us who don't write? And so perhaps Brittany can answer, or Brittany can't answer it, but Brittany will understand the question. I pick the book up. I start to read the book. I'm a lawyer. I read for an answer. I read looking to answer a question. I read looking to rebut an argument. Now I'm reading something that's actually interesting. And I actually read the book in one sitting. And I will say that didn't hurt that it was 250 pages. and it, because, I'm the founder of the Short Attention Span Theater. But the question for me is, and so I sat there and I read it and I'm like, I actually told John, I'm like, it's really an amazing book. When you write it, you said you thought about it 10 years ago. Do you write it in 3 months, 6 months, or do you write it in 10 years? I mean, mechanically, how does that happen?
Well, at this point, I've written, I'm working on a 7th novel.
Yeah.
None of them have unfolded the same way. My first novel I wrote while I had a full-time job, a little bit here and there. Other novels where I've gone through a really concentrated period of just sustained work, and within maybe 2 years, I can finish a book. I can't write a book in 3 months or 6 months. I think 2 years would be the shortest period in which I could do it. I guess, look, part of it is to sustain the whole, it's sort of like running a marathon, it's a huge thing. It's going to take a long time. You got to build it page by paragraph, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, page by page. You accumulate this. It's a big, a big, long, sustained effort. For that to work, for you to successfully see it through, at least in my case, you have to be enjoying what you're doing. First of all, you have to have this sort of deep, abiding passion that's driving you, that you won't quit because you care so much. And the other thing is, at least in my case, I love language. I love listening to words in my head and trying to find the right ones. I like revising. I like thinking through the relationship between this sentence and the next one. I like the beauty of language. So for me, that's a driver as well. With the final case, took me a long time to write the book because I was really confused. I really didn't know how to tell this story. I really didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to bring it all together. I knew that emotionally that somehow there was a convergence between the facts of the trial, my own circumstances as an adoptive father and the death of my father. I knew that somehow all these things were emotionally related for me, but how did they translate it into a story? It took a long time to sort out for me. I mean, I'm not in a hurry. I mean, it's not, lots of other things in life. So I don't make myself every day try to resolve the problems. It's okay if some time passes.
Sorry. Well, I was saying, Mike, just offer you briefly a different perspective, which is as a trial lawyer writing a book instead of an author writing a book, which David clearly is. We were very just goal oriented. We would stop work every day at 6 o'clock and we would write from 6 p.m. to 3 a.m. for 3 months until we had a book. And our books definitely did not look like David's book at the end of that 3 months. We had 1,400 pages that needed to be whittled down to 300. And I think it's kind of interesting, David, hearing you talk about it as an author versus as a lawyer, we just wanted a result, and we wanted to get everything on paper. So I think it was a very different process, which probably not the right process, but another way to arrive at some final product.
Yeah.
I have kind of the opposite experience in life. My father is an author. I'm the lawyer, and I really, it resonated with me, the narrator seeing boxes and boxes of case files when I would watch my dad for years writing his books and seeing all of his resource material and everything stacked up. What was interesting to me is how you decided to put together the book in 3 parts, almost, you know, as a lawyer, you hear pre-trial, trial, post-trial. That's just standard part of our everyday life. But it seems to be more than that in choosing how to divide the book. How did you ultimately decide to do it like that versus chapters?
Mhm. Well, in the sort of narrative sense, or the sort of storytelling strategy sense, I felt that I had in the pretrial section, first of all, I have a prologue. So that
Right.
prologue sets things up in a certain way and sort of provides a foundation from which to launch and introduces certain questions. And then the pretrial section is all about building drama and interest, because as things move forward, that you increase it. Let's get to the trial. Let's get to the trial. You know, I'm getting a lot of background. I'm seeing what this case is about. I'm learning about the people involved. I want to see what's going to happen. You know, it has an inherent drama to it. And then the second section, you know, the trial itself is again a sort of discrete unit of drama. You know, to do this chapter by chapter would be to be in conflict with the natural dramatic elements of the circumstances. It lends itself to this tripartite way of organizing it. And
I
certainly
loved it organized that way. I loved I was so hooked in the pre-trial part, in just it, when you're going to Boeing to interview witnesses, to try to get in, to go and see family members, driving, all of the things to work up your case that bring you back to hours and hours of time that you spend with witnesses as your case is falling apart, as you are trying to learn about what you can tell to really bring the jury your story. And I loved the way that you set that up in those 3 phases. And then it was 3 phases of life and humanity. It was so emotionally touching and legally amazing.
You know, going back to the earlier question about, you know, how long does it take to write a book? So I'm a very, you know, curious person in ways that take me off on tangents all the time. And that's part of what happens to me. So, you know, in the case of this book, you mentioned the Boeing chapter. You know, I went out to Boeing and I got very interested in the whole phenomenon of Boeing for a while. It's some sort of incredibly huge, complex business. And by the time I turned around and said, oh yeah, I'm not, this isn't about Boeing, this is about a book I'm writing. I need to get back, you know. That happens to me all the time. And it's happened to me ever since I was a child. And I don't know if there's some sort of term for it in cognitive science, but I go down pathways, I go into labyrinths, I go into mazes. That's why, you know, the internet is just a rabbit hole for me. I mean, I'll end up, and I'll tell somebody in my family, but what took you to that? I don't know. I clicked on this, I clicked on this, I clicked on this, and I kept clicking, and 20 clicks later, I got to that. And I wasn't in control. I wasn't in charge. And that's partly why my books take so long to write.
Well, can I just say that it's a really good example of both your skill as a storyteller and as an author, because really I didn't care much about what millwrights at Boeing do until we all got in the golf cart. And I'm like, and by the way, I have a terrible mouth, so I have to say the sentences in my head. I'm like, fuck yeah, let's find out what's going on at Boeing. And then I think that is, I mean, I realize it's not a central or even a, you know, it could not be any part of your story, but it's really the best example of this conversation with yourself that you've talked about, getting the right words and the right sentences and the right order. And we met all those 4 guys, including the last one who just happened to be there the day that Delvin was arrested. And so then, of course, it flows like a river, but you don't know that at the beginning. And still you're like, okay, I want to know what happens next.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the Boeing chapter is a good example of a reader could feel very justified in coming away like, why do we need to know all this? What does this have to do with the story?
Yeah.
From my point of view, everything that gets said by these different millwrights who get interviewed provides more context for who Delvin Harvey is, what his world is, what job he goes to every day, where he comes from, what circumstances he moves in. And I didn't feel like I didn't feel like anything in the Boeing chapter didn't belong, and that's one of the things I spend a huge amount of time asking myself when I'm writing. I need to get rid of this because it doesn't belong. That's what it really central question.
It belonged.
We try not to go too much longer than an hour and 15. So I have one thing I want to finish with, but before we do that, thank you, Kristen, Brittany, Mike, amazing job. Much better than my questions as always. But in particular today, seriously, great job, guys. David, thank you so much. It's really an honor to hear from you. And then if you guys will bear with me, sometimes I usually end with a quote. Does that make sense? Sometimes I usually. Those of us who are human beings, in particular lawyers, I really took from this book, we really have to remember that just by being decent to the people around us, we can make the world a better place. I think as lawyers, we should read that prologue every once in a while. It's short. We should read it to remind us why we went to law school. And then let me just read the ending, because it just all, for me, comes together with such an emotional power. In the golden glow of the lamp beside her bed, this is the narrator's wife, she swooped her readers on once more and turned some pages. Listen to this, she said. My whole life long, I've sharpened my sword, and now face to face with death, I unsheath it, and lo, the blade is broken, alas. She turned out the lamp. That's a good one, she observed. So many of those death poems are about cherry blossoms or plum trees. And then there's this guy who just decides to say, in the end, alas, I spent my whole life getting ready for this, and now my sword's broken. We laughed. Then Allison said things of the sort that sometimes are said on the cusp of sleep. Your dad kept his sword sharp right to the end, she said. Allison has a beautiful voice, but now he's gone, and so are my parents and your mother. I don't know, maybe she's wide awake right now in bed by herself with the wind blowing outside. I turned toward her. We were close in the dark. We can love people, whispered Allison. What else is there? So thank you, David, for writing that and writing this book.
Well, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed the discussion today. I really appreciate you inviting me.
Thank
Great.
you. Thank you.
Thank you, David. This is awesome.
Yeah, thanks so much. I cried sad commercials, so you can imagine how much Kleenex I went through
Right?
in your book, including that last paragraph.
Oh, yes.
I'd like to have a video of that, Mike, so if you could help us out. All right, thank you, guys. I'm going to have Roland shut it down. And everybody who was on, thank you for appearing and sending your messages and all the things you help us to get ready for it and the questions and caring about it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much.
Thank you.